And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Hi there, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska aviation weather outlook on this Monday, August 19th, 2024. And the main weather feature we're going to be watching is a strong low pressure system that'll be crossing through the western Bering and then the Bering Strait as we go through midweek. This is the remnants of once was a typhoon as it impacted Japan. We don't expect this system to be as strong as Merbach a couple of years ago, but it will be impactful along the west coast, especially Norton Sound and along the Seward Peninsula coastline and Bering Strait, and along the uninhabited side of St. Lawrence Island with some rather strong south-southwest winds that are going to cause water levels to come up on Norton Sound here for Wednesday. But in the meantime, we start Tuesday morning with areas of IFR, intercoastal mountains of the Panhandle, up along the Alcan border, Wrangell, St. Elias Mountains, up just north of the Alaska Range, and then up along the Brooks Range. We expect IFR conditions, as well as sections of the west and southwest coastline from Nome, St. Lawrence down to Etolan Strait, and then the frontal system associated with the low out there in the southwest Bering. That will have IFR conditions along it. As we go through the day Tuesday, that's going to advance eastward toward the west coast. Meanwhile, drying out, very nice weather, temporary ridge bringing generally VFR conditions across the Alaska Range, much of the mainland and down into the northern Panhandle. Southern central Panhandle may still hold on to some MVFR conditions, but this band of IFR is associated with the front. A push of moist air, but wind-driven. We have the low center back here, so this system, as it moves along into the west coast early Wednesday morning and then through the day Wednesday, lingering into Thursday, we expect the IFR conditions to exist areas of the Chukchi Sea, Bering Strait, along the Seward Peninsula, especially the west coast there, and also up into Kuskokwim, Bristol Bays, and along the eastern half of the Aleutians, creeping upwards along the Alaska Peninsula. Still plenty of VFR conditions across south central, southeast, central, eastern mainland, and much of the Panhandle here as we go through the day. Wednesday, this is where you're going to have your best conditions. Back to the west, though, strong winds coming up into Norton Sound will cause elevated surf and the potential for even some coastal flooding. And we are going to be watching IFR conditions, turbulent conditions, as those winds, the belt of winds spread across the western portion of the mainland. You're also going to have enhanced turbulence as well. So Anaktuvik Pass on Tuesday is looking, starting out with IFR conditions becoming MVFR. Same thing, Adigan Pass up there in the east central Brooks Range, IFR in the morning becoming MVFR. Along the Alaska Range, to start out the morning, MVFR conditions will be common along the length of the Alaska Range. Lake Clark, Merrill, as well as rainy and windy passes, all becoming VFR later morning and afternoon. And Isabel, same thing, some early morning MVFR conditions becoming VFR. Mentasta, also MVFR becoming VFR. Tanita Pass, Copper River Basin, generally VFR conditions are anticipated. Portage Pass, also VFR conditions on Tuesday. And then in the far north end of the Panhandle, IFR early Tuesday morning for Chilkoot and White, becoming VFR through the day, especially later afternoon and evening. And looking at the freezing levels, this clearly shows where the troughs and ridges are. We have a cooler trough of low pressure in the mid-upper levels of the atmosphere. That's why the surface freezing line is down to the Brooks Range. We have freezing levels aloft at 2,000 feet down to almost to the Yukon River. 4,000 foot freezing line pushes all the way down across the Alaska Range. And then to the west, here is what we have out ahead of the front, the sequential rise of the freezing levels of loft, showing the warm dome of air being drawn in ahead of the low that's sitting back here in this trough. And we're going to find freezing levels pushing toward the lower Yukon and, say, Kuskokwim, Bristol Bays, upwards of 10,000 feet, certainly by Tuesday afternoon. 12 and 14,000 feet, we find freezing levels above 14,000 feet across the eastern Aleutians. And where there is precipitation along these frontal boundaries, there is the potential for moderate icing above 6,000 feet over the Seward Peninsula, Bering Strait. As we get down here along the Yukon coastline, above 10,000 feet back towards St. Matthew, because again, this dome of warmer air is pushing somewhat north but more eastward. And then the lower Bering Sea, especially north of the Aleutians, we're looking at icing above 14,000 feet. So that's well above most, at least general aviation traffic. And looking at the ridges and troughs, we have a trough just over the Yukon territory, a ridge at 30,000 feet. So we have a band of a core of winds 110, 120 knots along the eastern mainland. But here's the main system. The upper level low at 30,000 feet, broad jet core of anywhere 120 to 130 knots from the west-southwest across much of the central Bering back toward the Aleutians, western central Aleutians, and then at 9,000 feet or 700 millibars, a broad belt of winds 50 to pockets of 60, 65 knots. Very broad area of strong winds in the mid-levels at 700 millibars. We also have a broad area of 40-knot winds, lower Gulf into the North Pacific, and then when we bring it down to 3,000 feet, here's that frontal system approaching the west coast. We have widespread 35 to 45 knot winds with some areas of 50 knot winds around St. Lawrence up toward the Gulf of Anadyr, and then back toward the west, a broad area of winds 50 to as high as 65 knots just south and southeast of the low center. So as a result, we're anticipating turbulence, moderate turbulence along areas of the west coast by Tuesday afternoon, generally surface to 4,000 feet. Certainly moderate turbulence out across the eastern Bering, St. Lawrence down through St. Matthew, Nunavik Island, and St. Paul. Back further west, where that core of 50, 60 knot winds, we'd expect severe turbulence in this region, but there's no land mass or area to fly there. And then along the length of the Aleutians, we're generally looking at moderate turbulence, surface to 4,000 feet. And so these stronger winds will continue to shift eastward toward the west coast as we get into late Tuesday night, and especially during the day Wednesday. So stay tuned to later forecast as it will be stormy weather here along the west coast midweek.